Thanks for coming, everyone. I guess I've been to Grand Rounds a few times, and usually Tom stands up and says something slightly diverse, off topic, and introduces the speaker, but we don't have Tom today, and I don't think we've got anyone else doing the introduction, so I'll introduce myself. My name's Russell. I'm one of the emergency medicine consultants. I'm also one of the associate postgraduate deans with the East region of the deanery. And my whole talk's going to be slightly off topic from the point of view of clinical medicine, but I hope that you'll see by the end that it's exceptionally relevant to the way that we practice for all of us. So I'll just crack on. I think that generally the slides will work fine, but I think if we turn the lights down a little bit, then that probably helps to a degree. So this is the sort of headline slide. So what do you think about thinking? And I reckon this is a little bit of CPD that everyone, if they're not aware of this kind of thing, needs to start thinking about and have a look into. And it probably falls under the umbrella term of human factors, but with human factors people generally think about team resource management, situation awareness. We've all heard about the parallels with healthcare and aviation industry and all that kind of thing. But the human factors itself really is just describing the way that humans interact with each other and the way they interact with technology and the environment around them. So if you understand human factors, then it helps you understand the limits of your performance. And the particular aspect of human factors that I'm going to talk about really could probably be described as critical thinking. So this fella is Francis Bacon. He's known as the father of scientific methodology, and he was kicking around in the 17th century. And he said this, actually. He said, critical thinking is a desire to seek, patience to doubt, fondness to meditate, slowness to assert, readiness to consider, carefulness to dispose, and set in order. And when he was speaking about that, he was talking about the importance of having a methodology towards scientific experimentation and things, and that it wasn't enough to just say the world is flat, but you needed to provide some evidence for that. And that's why he's sort of known as this figure, the father of scientific methodology. So just to try and take things slightly off the wall, we've got a little video here. And critical thinking, if you're wondering what that is, well, critical thinking is something which really helps in all sorts of situations, and especially when the stakes are high. And I think everyone would recognise situations in their own practice of when the stakes are exceptionally high. So this video just lasts for a wee minute. Let me know if you can't hear it.
We're all going after him after all. Fletcher, I'm giving you a commission. Hound this Wales to kingdom come. Hound him, Senator. A man like Wales lives by the feud. Because of what you did here today, I've got to kill that man. Well, he'll have to run for it now. And hell is where he's headed. He'll be waiting there for us, Senator.
That better?
Don't hold back count on me, Josie. I can ride.
I ain't holding back count of you, thick-headed grasshopper. First place, if we ride out in the open, there's enough posses over South Missouri to start another war. And if we try riding instead of thinking, well, end up hanging by a rope by nightfall.
So the last thing that he says there is, if we start riding instead of thinking, we'll be hanging from a rope by nightfall. And the first part that you may or may not have been able to hear was a description of how they're going to hound this guy, Josie Wales, to the gates of hell. And there's posses out all over the place searching for him. And the young companion with him says, don't hold back on account of me, we need to get riding. And Josie Wales says, if we start riding instead of thinking, we'll be hanging from a rope by nightfall. And this is part of the problem, really. And there's another guy that's around that had a big influence on the way things are today, and that's this guy, Thomas Watson Sr. He was an employee of NCR, or National Cash Register, and was one of the people that founded IBM, the computer manufacturer. And he said this in a board meeting back in 1911, the trouble with every one of us is that we don't think enough. We don't get paid for working with our feet, we get paid for working with our heads. And that's particularly pertinent in somewhere like an emergency department, but also the busy ward, where you just can't get thinking about doing things properly for trying to get the job that's right in front of your face done. We don't get paid for working with our feet. We get paid for working with our heads. What's it got to do with us? Well, the output of critical thinking, or the output of thinking or cognitive processing in medicine, is clinical decision making. And there's basically two types. There's decisions of classification, which is making a diagnosis, or decisions of expectation, or how to act, which is treatment plans. And another guy, Gert Gigerenzer, says the most important decision we have to make in life is how we make decisions. We can make them critically or otherwise. So when you decide that you're going to go to the cinema, you don't just randomly go in and say, "Can I get a ticket for the cinema, please?" and then walk into one of the screens, hoping that it's something that you like. You think about it and decide what film it is that you're going to see. That's, in a nutshell, is thinking critically. And every decision that we make, in many circumstances, ought to be like that. But making clinical decisions involves making judgments. And these judgments in medicine are usually based on evidence, or what we interpret as being evidence, and some faith-based knowledge, stuff that you were told as a trainee nurse or a trainee doctor or whatever it is that you do. But unfortunately, we're ever vulnerable to multiple things which impact on our judgment and how we use the knowledge and skills which we have. And these are just some things which we are doing all the time. So we identify meaningful patterns that don't exist. We see correlation as causation. You're fooled by illusions. Don't spot the obvious, can't see the wood for the trees. You fail to notice when things are not going right because you're busy absorbed in a task that you're doing. Misinterpret temporal relationships, which means that you see A and you see B and you just assume that they're related just because they're next to each other, but that could just be a random occurrence. And we believe these fallacies or untruths which we think are logical. And we're doing this, unfortunately, all the time. So I see the problem as being that undergraduate and postgraduate medical education, assessment, appraisal, it all focuses on clinical knowledge and skills. How much do you know? Can you pass this test? The test is asking us to describe or list things that cause something. It's all about demonstrating knowledge and skills. But there's a third aspect to it, and there's decision-making skills, which is how you use that knowledge and how you use those practical skills. When is it right to do that thing? When is it right to intubate someone? When is it right to put the chest drain in? When is it right to suture a wound instead of gluing it up or just putting a dressing on? And it's that part that I think we're neglecting and that we don't talk about and that isn't heavily involved in education. So perhaps how we reason, think and use the knowledge is actually the more important skill. And has it really got something to do with us? Is it really important? It's really important, okay? We know, and this isn't recent literature, this is stuff that we've known for 10, 15, 20 years. We know that most diagnostic errors can be attributed to a failure of the clinician's thinking rather than a lack of knowledge. Now, I would say that most of us in this room who are clinicians, whether you know, of whatever specialty or discipline, will have made a diagnostic error at some point or other. And how many times had you never heard of the condition that you missed, that you failed to diagnose? You know? It's not that you don't know about the condition, it's that you didn't arrive at that decision, you didn't arrive at that diagnosis. It's not a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of how you think about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we make decisions. And if you feel like shouting out, then that's fine, but I'm not asking you to. But if someone feels like shouting out, how much do you reckon this would cost? Taking a bit too long, but feel free to shout out. £6. Coffee and cake, £6. Okay. Can you just go up to the counter and say that coffee and cake should have been £6? There you go. You don't do that, do you? You wait. You do the right thing. Because somebody has to actually know how much things are on the menu, quantify it and add it up and tell you how much you need to pay. But it's fair enough, you might think coffee and cake £6. The problem is that what factors come into play there? That could have been coffee and cake at my house after I said to you, do you want a coffee and cake? And there's no charge for it. That could have been coffee and cake sitting on the deck outside Gleneagles, where it's actually £15 or £20 for coffee and cake. There are other factors which you haven't taken into account, but you can make a pretty good guess that on average it should be somewhere between £5 and £10. Okay? In order to know exactly how much it is, you need additional information. Okay? And the additional information is that you need to know how much coffee and cake is in this establishment, and you need to know how to add. So you need to know how to do arithmetic. Yeah? So when you said £6, Colin, what you were doing was providing an intuitive response. Okay? And an intuitive response is absolutely conditioned by the nature of the triggering event and the state of the person when it's encountered. So if you've decided that you don't like what I'm saying and you can't really be bothered listening to me, you may not have bothered thinking in your head how much coffee and cake cost. Yeah? That's because of the state of you when you encountered the question. Okay? The validity of the output, so how good your answer is going to be dependent on whether the information used is sufficient to make the decision and whether the interpretation of the information is biased or not. So if you asked somebody how much coffee and cake cost after they'd drunk it and they decided it wasn't very good, they might say a different thing from what they would have said beforehand, just from looking at it. And the information, if they don't have sufficient information, like you don't know where that coffee and cake was being served from, you might not be able to come to an accurate decision. The flip side of that is the deliberate response. The deliberate response relies on the use of additional information, as I've already said. In this case, it's the menu and how much it costs, the rules of arithmetic. But it may be that you use some sort of clinical decision rule, such as Ottawa-Uncle rules or some other rule. And the validity of the output of that is dependent upon whether the additional information is applied correctly to the problem. Okay. So we should now realise that it's not just what we know, but how we access, use and apply the knowledge. And we should be wondering why we don't teach this kind of thing. Okay. I'm going to get you to consider another problem here. Okay. Jack is looking at Anne. Anne is looking at George. Jack is married. George is not married. That's the little love triangle there. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? Has anyone got an answer that they think is right? Can anyone be bothered trying to figure out what the answer is? Hands up if you can't be bothered figuring out what the answer is. Hands up if you don't think there's sufficient information there. Okay. So the answer is that yes, a married person is looking at an unmarried person. Okay? Because we don't know whether Anne is married or not married. Okay? So whatever she is, a married person must be looking at an unmarried person. Because if she's not married, then Jack's looking at her. And if she is married, then she's looking at George. So the information's all there, and it wasn't tricky, but you couldn't be bothered figuring it out. And that's really important to be aware of. Okay? Because that is known as being a cognitive miser. Can't be bothered thinking about it. Okay? And it's one of our limitations as human beings. Okay? And we've got a bunch of limitations. The first one is that we're really emotional and we can't turn that off. Okay? If you don't like what I'm saying, you're now becoming bored of it and you're not listening anymore. If it's really ringing a bell, then you're getting really interested in it, and you perhaps are getting too interested in it and thinking, wow, that's really clever. We don't, unlike the Duracell bunny, we don't have never-ending reserves of mental and physical energy. We tire out. Okay? And because of that, we're programmed, it's built within us to try and conserve as much energy as we can. Okay? So we don't bother thinking, and that's where this cognitive miser thing comes in. If it's too much work, we won't do it. And the last thing is that we're really easily distracted. Okay? And once you're distracted, then you stop thinking about the problem at hand. So, we've all got tendencies to behave in certain ways. It's totally predictable. And you could term that as being bias. Okay? Bias is a normal human operating characteristic. So if you think that you're not biased, then I would say you've got a blind spot bias. You don't realise, you're not aware of the fact that you're biased, because we're all biased. And unfortunately, because we work in the hospital, we all work in this really wicked learning environment, okay? So a kind learning environment, people receive timely and veridical feedback. I like that word because I'd never heard of it before I read this. So I got to look up the dictionary and see what it meant. But veridical just means true, so absolutely true feedback. Okay? And in wicked learning environments, you don't receive timely and true feedback. And everywhere we work is a wicked learning environment. I just want you to consider this, okay? So consider misdiagnosis. There's probably two types of misdiagnosis. I know it's an oversimplification, perhaps, but just humour it. You get a false negative misdiagnosis, which is the one that we probably have all think about, which is when the clinician mistakes well for unwell. Okay? The clinician decides that the person doesn't have the medical problem and makes an incorrect treatment plan. And then the patient comes to harm. And sometimes that might be in a really overt way. Yeah, we all know what I mean by that. And it triggers a really exaggerated response. Okay? A multitude of emails, executive board involvement, red flag datics, layers, all the rest. Okay? It may have been a small error. And then you get false positive misdiagnosis, when the clinician mistakes unwell for well. And the clinician, again, makes an incorrect treatment plan. And the patient comes to harm in a really subtle way, okay, which you perhaps don't even notice. They have to undergo invasive investigations. There's psychological harm associated with the possibility of having a serious illness. There's financial loss. There's the problem of who's going to look after the children, who's going to look after the dog whilst you're undergoing these investigations. I can't go to work. They contribute to crowding in treatment areas. Now, in the emergency department, I know exactly what that means, but I suspect in most of your places of work, you also experience crowding. Crowding in outpatient clinic areas, crowding in diagnostic labs, because there's far too many tests coming in anywhere you work. And it slows down the availability of results, and it slows down access to definitive treatment, slows down access to theatre and the surgeon, slows down all of that stuff. And there's zero response triggered at all. Okay. So what factors influence your thinking, do you think? We could start with intuitive. Does anyone want to shout out what things might influence intuitive thinking? Past experience. Okay, good. Yep. That's on the list. Anything else? Context. Ambient conditions. Whether you're too hot or too cold. Yeah? Whether you need a wee, whether you're hungry, whether somebody's just upset you, whether you really fancy the other person that's working with you, whether you're a boy or a girl, personality, stuff that you were taught as a child which you didn't even know you were being taught, that was handed down through your grandparents. So hard wiring. And then there's stuff which influences your deliberate thinking. And that's stuff which you're perhaps a bit more aware of. So what kind of thing might influence your deliberate thinking? Should be stuff which we've all been through. It's really about your knowledge, or what you perceive as being knowledge, faith-based knowledge. Education you've been through, training, critical thinking, your ability to reflect and look back on things that have happened and draw and learn from it. Your logical competence. You know, we speak about people who are very clever but don't have any common sense. What does that mean? Well, it probably means that they're not a very rational person and they lack logical competence. They might be really clever and have good recall, but logically they're incompetent. Rationality and the intellectual ability. So if these things influence our thinking, then we need to think about, well, okay, that's stuff which I can understand what all these things are, but what about bias? Because you've spoken about bias. What's that? Why have I put why have I got a sort of shadow of bowls behind the what is bias sign? Bias means a few different things. If you look it up in the dictionary, it will mean different things. But basically, for those of you that are not familiar with lawn bowls, they curve. They don't roll straight. It's not a 10-pin bowling ball. It doesn't roll straight. It's got a weight in one side or the other, which might be, which may be different depending on the bowl, and it curves. Okay, and that's how you manage to. That's how the game's played. Because if another bowl is in the way, then you can use the weight to curve the ball around it. But if you don't know that bias is there, and you play a trick on someone and say, roll this ball down to where that jack is, and they don't know that it's there, then the ball will continually roll off and not hit the mark. Okay? If you want to actually hit the spot, then you need to know that the bias is there and take account for it. Don't remove the bias. You might not, from a point of view of a human, you probably won't be able to do that. But if you know that it's there, then you can account for it. So bias in humans can be described as a cognitive disposition to respond. Okay, so it's just the way that you're going to respond. And it's a tendency to respond in certain ways, and it's totally normal. It's just the way it is. Okay? What do you prefer, blondes or brunettes? Well, it doesn't matter which one. As long as you're aware it's one, then you're going to be biased towards that. They're robust and they're really difficult to remove. And they're situational, and they're made worse by anything which affects your well-being or your emotional state. So they're made worse by tiredness, stress, sleep deprivation, cognitive overload, so being asked to do lots of different things at once or think about different things at once. All of these are situations which we're all under all the time at our workplace. And they are predictable, and nowadays they've got a taxonomy. So taxonomy, they're classified, they're written down, we know what they are. You can one way of classifying them is in affective biases, cognitive biases, and social biases. Affective biases are when the affective state or the emotional state of the decision maker adversely affects decision making. It's a failure of rational or logical decision making, and it's usually associated with hot emotional states. So you're either angry or upset or passionate about something. Okay? A good way to make somebody emotional is to be rude to them or just not be kind to them. Okay? So, does any of you know the magnitude, how much of an effect being rude or uncivil in the workplace has? Do you know? Do you think anyone knows? We've known for about 10 to 20 years how detrimental it is on a workplace if people are rude and uncivil to each other. And rudeness is something which people are not that familiar with. It's very rare for somebody in the workplace to actually be rude to someone else, but being uncivil has exactly the same effect. So not holding a door open for someone, making a cup of coffee for 6 people and not the 7th person that's in the tea room, not saying good morning as you walk through the concourse, that kind of thing. Dalai Lama would say, be kind whenever possible, it is always possible. Cognitive biases is, again, another failure of rational or logical thought. And these are the way that they tend to be categorized. So you get errors of over-attachment to a particular diagnosis. So you decide this is the diagnosis and you don't let somebody dissuade you from that. You, despite evidence building up that that's an incorrect diagnosis, you stick to it because that's what you decided that it was. Errors due to failing to consider an alternative diagnosis. And that might be because you're not aware of the other diagnosis, or it may be that you don't think that it's probable or something like that. Errors due to inheriting someone else's thinking. It was handed over to you that this is what's wrong with someone, despite the fact that it's not yet been proven. Errors in understanding what the prevalence of that condition is in the community. Errors involving the patient's characteristics or the way that they've presented. It's another, this druggie has come in with a sore leg, it's going to be a DVT, not really thinking about what else it could be. Errors associated with your own personality. We've heard about affective biases, cognitive biases, and the third one is the social biases. These are ones we're probably more familiar with, and we think of them as being particularly unpalatable traits, but they exist within all of us. So they move along racial lines, gender, obesity, ageism, mental health, substance. In a hospital, we need to think about specialty bias, you know. It's quite funny to talk about orthopods and say they don't know how to read an ECG, but if the orthopaedic doctor is telling you that someone on their ward is having an MI, and you take half an hour to get there because you don't believe them because they're an orthopod, then you may have just wasted half an hour of the person who's having an MI's time. Okay? That would be a social bias. And I've written under here as fundamental attribution error, just because I think it's one of the most important specific biases, which is when you assume that whatever that patient's problem is related to one of their is related to a particular attribute of theirs. So, for instance, this is Tommy from Trainspotting, and he's a drug user, and ultimately he dies in the movie. He dies of HIV, or he gets HIV and dies of toxoplasmosis from his cat. But the assumption is when you meet someone like that is whatever problem they've got is because they're a drug user, and don't take into account all the other things that it could be. If you don't like that touchy-feely way of looking at it, then this is a more scientific approach. You look at rationality, and things that might affect rationality or negatively affect it. There will be a processing problem or a content problem. Cognitive miserliness, which you must all now believe exists because you demonstrated it beautifully already. So a failure to think properly or hard enough. Or maybe you've got a mindware gap, which is when you've got a failure of the knowledge or the additional information that's required in order to make a decision. Or perhaps you've got that, but it's been contaminated because you're biased and you don't know how to use that knowledge, or you use it in an incorrect way. So, I'm going to try and give you another example, just in case you're not believing me that these things exist yet. I'll give you another example, talk you through another example, which is not healthcare related, so hopefully you shouldn't get anyone's backs up. But this guy is David Rudisha, okay? He's Kenyan, and this is him at London 2012, having won the 800 metres, okay? And he set a new world record in the process, hailed as being one of the greatest 800 metres runners of all time. Just out of interest, who thinks that Kenyans are good at long distance running? That's nearly everybody. So, since 1980, Kenyan athletes have won about 40% of the top honours available to men in international athletics, from 800 metres to marathon. Okay? It's fair to say that Kenyans are pretty good at endurance running, as you've all just agreed with that. And you probably would say, well, it's fair to say that future endurance races will be won by Kenyans. Is that fair to say? But are Kenyans really good at endurance running? If you look at it a bit closer, you could change one word. Since 1980, Kenyan athletes have won about 40% of the top honours available to men in international athletics. It's actually Kenyans that are good at endurance running. Who's ever heard of a Kenyan? Couple of you. Good. So we'll unpack a little bit more information. Okay. This is a map of Kenya, and the different colours represent the concentration of top distance runners relative to the regional population. So the national norm is 1. Okay? So if you come from the coastal areas of Kenya, you're actually so bad at distance running, or that there's no top distance runners. Okay, then you get that middle area, eastern, well, it's kind of half as good as other places. Nairobi, if you're from the big city, the capital, you're rubbish. Look at this tiny little dark shaded area, 22.9. Okay, they've got 22.9 times the concentration of top distance runners than the rest of Kenya. Around about half of the Kenyan athletes come from Nandi district, which is the bit that's really dark. So it's actually Kenyans from Nandi district that are especially good at endurance running. So why is that? Why is that? So the lay literature, if you're interested in things like this, like I am, then the lay literature will tell you why, because you can go and buy books about why, and you can read newspaper articles and things about why Kenyans are so good at running. And these are the kind of things which get suggested. It's because they're genetically predisposed to be superior runners. It's because they have to walk or run long distances to go to school when they're children, so they make up their 10,000 hours of training. It's because they've got really strict marriage practices that promote natural selection of athletes. It's because of their cattle herding heritage, and they're on their feet all the time. They live at altitude, they don't wear shoes as children, and have developed a different way of running, which is one of the favourites. None of these things are particular to Nandi district in Kenya. You could say the same about lots of places around the world, yet they're mooted as being reasons. So, do you think there's some biases at play here? Almost certainly. There's social biases, the effect of one's nationality. That is completely arbitrary. Nationality means nothing. That's just something that we devised and drew some lines on the map. The fact that you're Kenyan means nothing. The effect of one's outwardly visible characteristics. You probably know what I'm getting at here. And it's not just social biases, there's some cognitive biases at play. And that is that a lot of us are biased about information that we haven't acknowledged or considered. So, the facts are that 28 out of 36 Olympic 5 and 10k medals were won by Scandinavians in the early 1900s. That's about as far removed from our ideas of race and racial stereotyping as Kenyans as you could get. Following that, Australians and New Zealanders were particularly good. And then during the 80s, Seb Coe, Steve Ovett, Steve Cram, we're probably conscious of these people, were particularly good. So if you don't know that stuff, then that's a blind spot. Okay? And having a blind spot affects your ability to process the information. There's another thing you get called narrative fallacy, which is when the biases and false attributions play into a story which is completely false, but in a way it's a little bit self-fulfilling. So this is the story which we're probably all familiar with. Kenyans developed into some sort of superhuman breed of human, predisposed to be great endurance athletes, and they're always going to win the big races. That story leads to the following things. Competitors think, I'm racing Kenyans, I'll never win. Spectators demand, race organisers invite Kenyans and pay them lots of money to come to the big races. Athletes from other countries focus on other events because there's no point in racing the Kenyans because they're too good. And amateurs dream of being a Kenyan athlete. And whether or not you agree with me or not, the fact is you can go online and buy a t-shirt that says, in my mind I'm a Kenyan, and in my legs I'm a chubby white guy. You know? So that false story exists. But there is a pattern, right? We've got to accept Kenyans do win big races. So what's the story? Well, they've got a common goal among the athletes training for long distance running events, whoever you are, is that's to become good at it. And in Nandi district of Kenya, the metric of being good is whether you've got a world record, a world championship medal, or an Olympic medal. Okay? So they got really good at winning medals at major races. Being quite good isn't very good at all. If you're not the world champion, you're nothing, because the guy two doors down the road is. So it's seen as a road to wealth. There's numerous role models of people who've been Olympic and world champion. They believe the false story as well, believe that they're born to run, and there's lots and lots of them. They train really hard using world-class performance as the measure of success, and some of them become world-class athletes. If you think about it, if 8 of the 10, let's say 8 of the 10 based best 800 metre runners are Kenyan, but only 5 of them are allowed to enter the Olympics, then that means that the Kenyan national selection race is the hardest 800 metres race in the world. It's harder than the Olympics. No wonder when they go, they're good. And they are great runners, because they work at it. It's not a gift. It's not a special predisposition. Once people realise that, they can go, train with them, learn from them. And now, as we know about Mo Farah, okay, not 800 metres, but 5 and 10,000 metres, you can beat them. What's it got to do with medicine? Well, is there parallels in our world? Well, there must be. There's plenty of centres where performance indicators are consistently better than others in many aspects of care or training. And people say these things about it. And I know that because I've been listening to that just in the last few days. They've got a different population, better provision of primary care, more staff, more money, less patients. The patients they have are healthier or better behaved for some reason. These are just like saying they don't have any shoes or they're from a cattle herding background. We miss the obvious because we don't want to change. And these things are at play. Blind spot biases, not knowing what the situations are. Cognitive dissonance, which is when the evidence is irrefutable but you just ignore it. It's not there. It's not real. I was right. I'm right. I'm not going to listen to the evidence. Status quo bias, which is a reluctance to change. And the worst one in my mind, which is the not invented here bias, which is, well, that might be what they do there, but we're not doing it that way here. What could we do about it? Well, I think we need to recognise how important critical thinking is and how the clinical decision making has got such a big role to play in patient safety and also in staff welfare and how we go about our job. We need to learn about cognition and cognitive error, and we need to learn how to mitigate against it. We need to learn about metacognition, cognitive debiasing. We need to go and read about it, and we need to spread the word. I've got one more video. Alternatively, you could be like Granny Hawkins.
You know what I say?
What's that?
I say that big talk's worth a doodly squat.
It's 22. We've still got a bit of time. I don't know if anyone's got any comments or questions or wants to discuss anything. I'm happy.
In a sort of semi-practical way, can you think of approaches to the assessment of mental capacity that would utilise that? That's really you making decisions and someone else's ability to make decisions. So you're trying to factor in some of these more subtle considerations in two ways. I don't know if that's going to be too difficult.
Yeah, well, I think it completely is going to play into that. So the question was, how could you factor this into making decisions about somebody's mental capacity? I think in its most simple terms, then we know what the sort of formal way to assess mental capacity is, and what the patient needs to be able to demonstrate, whatever the circumstance or situation is, what they need to be able to demonstrate in order to show that they have mental capacity is. If you go into the conversation with a presupposition that they don't have mental capacity, or that they do have mental capacity, then prior to doing that assessment, then you're going to be biased to the outcome, and you're just going to write down what you think anyway. If you are harassed because somebody has just emailed you that day to tell you that you need to finish a report by the end of the day, and you know that you've only got 3 hours to the end of the day, and then you've got to pick up the kids, you're harassed. You're not going to do it properly. If you haven't had your lunch yet and you need to do this, and your boss is telling you that you need to get it done because they want to do a procedure that particular afternoon, you're not going to do it properly. So I think that it does play into it, because it plays into all decision making in that way. If you're not aware of those things influencing how you're going to approach the problem, then you're not going to do it properly. And if you are aware of them, then okay, I don't believe that being aware of them is enough, but if you are aware of them, then at least you might And you might take a little bit more time over it. You might say, right, okay, I've got to go and do this, but I'm going to do it properly. I'm going to go through these particular topics. I'm going to go through these particular problems. Does that?
And the other thing is trying to infer those same considerations in the patient.
Yeah, very difficult. But I guess when you're assessing when you're assessing somebody's competence or capacity, you're perhaps not asking them to make a decision. You're making an assessment of them. It's you that's making the decision. But I think you're right. What about if somebody has capacity and they're making a decision which you think is perhaps a poor one? Then how good is their decision making, and what factors are influencing that? And you may well need to try and be aware of things which you've done or which are happening around you, which are influencing the patient's decision making, which is important.
So, as clinicians in different fields go through levels of seniority, often get put on management programs, leadership programs, is this something that then is just completely overlooked and all that, and perhaps should be much like you're teaching any type of advanced electrical engineering constructors course? Is there something that should be rolled out to go on this type of awareness course to get a better idea of themselves to help their management decisions?
Well, I don't know how many consultants or senior nurses or management level people there are in this room. I don't know what the general feeling would be, but my feeling as a consultant is that yes, it's completely overlooked, and yes, it should be. This sort of thing needs to come into all of our education.
I'm going to dispute that, I'm afraid. I'm a lecturer in behavioral social science, and I'm actually the lead coaching practice in the director of medicine, and I am teaching this from year 1 and 2. And what I find fascinating in this talk is that you can really bring in the actual emergency examples. That's what I would have liked to hear more about, how you are actually biased enough to the environment, firstly, and secondly, what kind of de-biasing strategies have you developed to discount your work about biases?
Yes. Well, this is the thing. So, because of the way that we feed into everything else in the hospital, try to take it away and not create an emotional or affective bias to the conversation or the presentation. I steered away from that, but it would be interesting. I think we definitely when we teach it, then we go into all of that. From the point of view of cognitive de-biasing strategies and things, well, I think we're quite far away from that, because as yet, if people are not aware, then it's difficult to move towards that. Now, I have no doubt that there's already some teaching about this in the medical school, but when you ask the medical students, and we get them in 4th and 5th year, they're not aware of it. And recently I've had the opportunity to speak with medical students from Glasgow and Cardiff, and they weren't aware of it. Or they say they're not aware of it. So how do we bring it to I've no doubt it's happening, but how do we make it so that it's mainstream and it's right there at the front of people's minds?
But can I make an example of actually having you create de-biasing strategies within complex executive systems? And that would be creating different tools that allow you to think differently rather than changing the way you think, because that's very difficult anyway. So if you think back, I don't know if you know the Bromley case, the Cambridge Bay very famous case, where there was a bias there in terms of escalating to tracheostomy, and now what the Medical Society have created is a fantastic airway rescue trolley that has all different drawers, plan A, B, C, D, and then you're more likely to have them to escalate to tracheostomy in a similar situation.
So we are, in our department, we are now talking about things like force and functions and all this kind of thing. So we're talking about it, and we're recently, so last month, did a full day of teaching on this stuff with EM trainees from around Scotland and through in Larbert. But it takes a full day. But in an hour, you kind of go into everything. But yeah, I mean, it's there. We're trying to do it. I'm sure we'll chat later. But we're trying to do it. We're aware of things like that. We know that there are lots of things that are out there that people do. Most of this stuff is not something which nobody has ever encountered. They perhaps just lack the awareness of what it is that's there. So when we speak about forcing functions, another good a good non-clinical example would be when you go to a cash machine and it gives you your card back before the money. That's because the reason you've gone to the cash machine is to get cash. So if they give you the cash first, you would take the cash and go away. Especially if you were in a hurry to get to the kebab shop, or your child was pulling on your arm and saying, "Mummy, mummy, 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 mummy," you would take the cash and go. So it forces you to do the thing that's important, which is take your card as well. Thanks for that. Yeah, so there's, although the sort of scholarly literature, if you like, sort of psychology journals and that sort of thing goes back for years. There are articles from big journals like JAMA and all that from about 2009. Mainstream literature, as in books, published in about, so there's a couple of books published 2015 and 2016. One's the ABC of Clinical Reasoning, which is a very thin, one of the BMJ ABC series. It's a good book. And there's another one called The Science of the Art of Medicine, which is tries to dissect what we all traditionally speak about science and art in medicine, and it tries to break down the sort of art component, which is basically your decision making, and get into why we do the things we do. So they're both small books, easy to read. And I mean, if you go in the literature and look stuff up, then cognitive debiasing, look up, and a particular leader in the field is a guy called Pat Crosscarry. If you put his name into search engines, then he'll come up with loads of stuff.
If checklists work really well and people are biased in decision making, is there an argument for trying to take the decision making, diagnosis and things away from doctors and using medical staff to collect information and then hand it to an automated system to do that next step? And should we be thinking in terms of basically taking you away from the bits that are you?
Yeah, so there probably is an argument for that, but the problem is that it's so complex. It's so complex. And just, so if you like I know that there's IT experts here, but a computer depends on the information going into it being correct in order for it to produce a correct response. Yeah, I know, but I understand that a lot of the stuff of the information that comes in isn't correct. So that is part of being a clinician, is filtering out the information and recognising the stuff that's really important, less important, the stuff that's not being said, which actually is very important, the stuff which is being said, which is perhaps not important, the context, the emotional state of the person, what they perceive as being a problem based on their previous experience, or what the diagnosis was in the past. There are so many factors that I think if that was, it would be great if those tools existed, but I think that computer where you put the information in and it comes out works only when the information is simple enough. And so much of what we do is not that. It's just so complex. But I've no doubt there's people out there trying to do it. Effectively, they will use that sort of thing is a clinical decision-making tool, and that tool will only work if it's relevant, if it's the right tool for what you're asking it to do.
But if the decision-making tool is something that makes a decision for you, or it's something that offers a decision, and it's at some point always any automated system will get something wrong, and any human will get something wrong. But there must be some places where you go, actually the system's wrong, it will be better if you were in. And finding those bits where
Yeah, I think, as I've said, I think we use decision-making tools. It's about, they're one of they are a de-biasing strategy that we use. It's about applying them correctly, and not every situation that a doctor will find them in will be would lend itself to a decision-making tool. So I agree, they'll have their part to play, but they're not going to be the complete answer.
There was a place in, I think, the Netherlands, where they built interlock gates to stop flooding in the port. And they deliberately, it was about 20 years ago, I think, they deliberately didn't put a manual override in, because they came to the conclusion that a person would mess up their override more often than they would completely. And so that changed it from being used at all.
Yeah, but
You are part of the system within a tool.
But you can't. Well, I'd be really interested to hear what the automated tool would be for deciding whether to suture up a wound on a 5-year-old's head that didn't actually, perhaps needs. You might get a better outcome with suturing, or you might get a better outcome with glue. It depends on whether they'll hold still and stop screaming, and all the other factors that come into play. And there isn't going to be. I would challenge that you could come up with an automated tool that makes that decision. That's going to have to be a clinician. Okay. Thank you.